do they really need it? Do I really need to be providing a mineral supplement or a vitamin supplement to my cows? They seem to be doing just fine. So why would I need to spend that money to supplement them additionally? And really, the question comes down to, well, how do we know we're not observing subclinical deficiencies, right? Now, those subclinical deficiencies are those really we don't see with the naked eye. And so, what we're really trying to do is eliminate those subclinical deficiencies. Now, there are times where we could get in trouble with our minerals or vitamins, where we see those clinical deficiencies, and of course, we're really going to see those with the naked eye. Um, so when it comes to providing minerals, we're really trying to get right at the peak where that red arrow is for the optimal range. Now, when we get to that range, essentially we are providing enough mineral supplementation to our animals that if we supply any more, we're not going to see any response. So that's why we don't have that red arrow in the center of the optimal, because once you make it so far with the mineral supplementation, you're actually going to see the response plateau off. And so we just want to be inside of that peak. That way, we're not wasting money, essentially. We're not over supplementing to the point where, we're not seeing that response. We're not throwing away money by providing that mineral. We're also trying to stay away from those subclinical toxicity issues as well if we were to over supplement a certain mineral. There are times where we can have that when it comes to, there's some evidence out there that copper can actually be one of those minerals that if we provide too much, we can actually see a reduced performance. So again, we're trying to stick right there where the red arrow is, to where we're meeting that optimal range for performance for our animals. So is it worth it? Now, when it comes to providing mineral, we do have some research that out there that states that when we provide mineral supplementation, the performance that we will see. And so, for example, we're only going to cite, there's numerous papers out there, but we're really only going to stick to one paper here. And this paper here was talking about how they were supplementing additional zinc, and they were able to see a tenth of a pound gain performance in those nursing calves. Now, for this mineral, they were providing that. They were looking at these calves over a period of 150 days, and they were able to add that tenth of a pound per day. Now, when we think about in today's markets, we look at 15 pounds per calf that we wean off, and if we're getting around $5 for that animal, that's a $75 value per calf that we're able to add to that. Just by some additional mineral supplementation, and that being zinc in particular. So what does that cost, and how does it pay for itself essentially? And so on the screen here, we're kind of showing you some different values of mineral wherever your mineral program runs you currently. We're setting out with some of our mineral that we're formulating currently. It's about $1,000 to $1,200 per ton. And so when we talk about 4 ounces per head per day intake, we're looking at around $44 to $54 per animal. Now, I just told you that if we were to provide additional zinc to those calves, we're seeing an increase in value of that animal by $75. So essentially, by doing that, we're able to pay for our mineral program. Now, you're going to see over at the side that we have 6 ounces per head per day. The reason we're including that is so when we talk about our target range for our cows at a 4 ounce per day, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in our series, but that nursing calf also consumes mineral too. And so then you might be targeting a disappearance rate of about 6 ounces per day. And so when you're doing that, you're looking at about 68 to $82 a head per day. Again, if we're sticking around that $1,000 for a mineral program, we're still making that mineral program pay for itself. Now, that's in the markets today. It does become a little bit harder to pencil that in when the markets fluctuate, and possibly if we see these cattle prices roll backwards a little bit, it will get a little bit tighter in the margins. But again, we could still see some performance that increases the value for those animals.
And I just want to be clear that that was only looking at providing zinc. And we're going to talk today about a multitude of minerals that we may want to look at supplementing. And so, you can kind of think about them as all having different effects, and some of which would be additive effects, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Okay, so what do you need to know? Let's see. What do you know and what do you need to supplement? So for most minerals, sampling, we typically hear producers tell us if we ask them, how do you determine the status of your animals? First things that come out, blood and liver. And what we want to say is, yes, liver can help you determine status for certain minerals, such as copper, selenium, vitamin A. However, it's not really a good option for you to use for many of the other minerals. And blood, because of the homeostasis with blood levels, it's definitely not one of those areas that can tell you the status of the animal. Because the whole point of the body is to maintain a certain threshold, and that's what the blood's going to be doing. So what we would tell you is the best way for a producer to determine the status of their herd is to evaluate their feedstuffs. One of the ways you do that is sampling your forages. Now, there is a lot of variability in mineral content in forages. So whenever you see averages that are published, you need to take that with a grain of salt because where you live can be different even from your neighbor and what their mineral content is in their forages. Many different things change this, and so such as plant species that are present, soil characteristics, soil fertility, stage of plant maturity, and climatic conditions. I know producers that are up in South Dakota where they have pastures that are up against each other, and the selenium content is toxic in one pasture and not as bad in the other pasture. So that's certain things that you would want to evaluate and test your own forages. By testing your own forages, you can also help you develop a supplementation program that can be more cost effective to you. You're going to know exactly where you're falling short or that your forage is actually meeting the requirements of the animal. And it can help reduce the cost if you were providing a custom mineral or if you are shopping for certain mineral packages essentially at your co-op.
Yeah, and I'll just point out stage of plant maturity is probably a big one that you need to think about as you're sampling. So in general, as plants mature, the mineral content decreases. And so if you tend to sample, you don't sample in the early growth, say, of your pasture, you'll underestimate what you're providing early in the season versus late in the season. So we do want to sample over time so that we have a fairly good idea of here's kind of the low and the high of what I'm providing and think through, okay, what do I need to meet my needs at the various times of year?
Yeah. I do have one thing to say again on that last slide, Mary, is the soil characteristics. I've seen producers post online about taking soil samples to check what their mineral content is. A soil sample can give you a little bit of an idea of maybe what's there or what could be available from the soil. However, mineral content varies on how much it draws up or how it draws it up into that plant. So I would not exclusively rely on soil samples to tell you what the mineral content is of your forage.
100%. When we talk about soil characteristics, I mean, pH is a big factor. And so just because you have certain minerals in the soil profile, how available they are, and various ones vary depending on the soil pH. And so it's much better to just go to the source. What are the animals eating? Let's sample that.
Exactly. So speaking of going to the source and what are the animals eating, that's exactly what we would ask a producer to do when it comes to sampling their forages. Currently, we have cows on a research project for mineral, and that's exactly what we're doing. We'll go up there from time to time to collect forage samples. We stay back from the cows to figure out what they're grazing. We take a pair of binoculars with us or a spotting scope to try our best to look and see where they're grazing at, the length of the forage that they're grabbing in their mouths when they bring their heads up. So we know if they're eating small stuff versus tall stuff. And then we actually go to where they are and we're trying to figure out what plant species they're actually biting off and looking at that. We're paying attention to how much grazing height they're taking off. And when we talk about grazing height and when you're taking that sample, if you see a spot where they grazed, you don't want to take a sample from that spot because they ate the top of the plant. They did not eat the base of the plant. And so if you take the base of the plant, that is not a good representation of what that animal is eating. It could actually skew your results of what the forage is providing to that animal.
Yeah.
Leaf and stem select. Oh, go ahead, Mary.
Well, I would just say, we kind of go to the extreme of like, the binoculars or whatever, but I do want to say like you can pretty well tell like what has been selected, and you can also kind of understand if cattle have been in there for a while. If you look, you can kind of tell which plant parts that they are currently eating versus ones they ate earlier, and so you can just walk the field and get a fairly decent idea of what they're consuming now.
Yeah, yes, you can. So we're also monitoring that leaf and stem selection if they're grazing, the species preference that they're going after. Just recently we were, well, I guess it's been a while now since we've been up there, but they were out on dormant range, and we noticed that they were really hunting down the bluegrass that was still present actually in that pasture. And so we paid close attention as we were sampling to make sure we got adequate sample of that. And then the grazing pressure on the field can also influence what they're actually getting a hold of. You're trying to simulate the bite size height. And so actually I have my pocket knife in my pocket, Mary. And so to demonstrate how we collect those samples, and we're trying to mimic exactly what the cow is doing. And so we'll take a knife and just lay the grass across that blade and twist up and break that grass as if we were a cow, right, grazing. If we're in one spot, we're going to take a small sample here, here, and here, as if that was the cow's head moving as they're moving through the pasture. We're going to walk in zigzag or in a W pattern. That way, we're trying to get as much variation as we can from different spots in the field without overdoing it. There's an amount where you're going to get a pretty good sample that's justifiable for that pasture. You do want to try to avoid those hot spots around the water, the gates, shade where cows hang out throughout the day. They'll get up and they'll graze that off, and there's not going to be much of an adequate sample there for you to collect, or they'll overgraze that area. So that's one area that you kind of want to steer clear of. When it comes to sampling harvested forages, we highly recommend you using a hay probe. So if you are doing grab samples from a bale, you're not getting a representative sample from the field. Essentially, you're only grabbing about 1 square foot of the field when you do that. And so by using a hay probe and going through the side of the bale, like you see in the image here, this allows you to get small amounts from multiple layers of the bale that's giving you more representation of the field in which that bale was harvested. The probe also gives you more representation of that leaf to stem ratio that is present in that bale as well.
Okay, so now we're going to kind of jump into some of the questions that you guys asked in our little survey, and of course, the main question everybody wanted to know is like, what do I need to supplement, right? So the first thing that we need to talk about before we can get there is kind of like, well, what minerals do cattle need? And there are 17 minerals that are required by beef cattle, and I think this is one of the reasons why it can seem so overwhelming. Currently, we have established requirements for 13, and really what that means is that there's 4 of them that we know cattle require. If you feed like a purified diet without them, you will see negative effects. However, in the real world, we just don't have them in terms of deficiencies, and so we don't have really good understanding of what the minimum amount is we can feed. But from a practical standpoint, we don't really have to worry about them because they are usually sufficient in diet. So of these 13, then we can break them down into 2 categories. The first category is what we call macro minerals. So they're required in percent of the diet. So these are calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. These macro minerals, the key thing to understand about them is they have limited storage in the body. So they are required in a constant supply. So if these are deficient, we do need to be making sure we are consistently providing what the animals need. And probably the easiest way to think about that is like if you think about clinical deficiencies, we say they're pretty rare, but like grass tetany would be a clinical deficiency. So grass tetany is a magnesium deficiency. And it is because the cattle do have a requirement that they need to consistently be consuming enough magnesium to meet their needs. If they don't, then we can have, of course, what happens in grass tetany happen, which is, they croak over on us. But we have the other category, which is trace minerals. And so if we think about trace minerals, these are probably the ones that you get the most, you're the most out of them, if that makes sense, and probably the most advertising, because there's probably more commercially available forms and sources of trace minerals than, of course, macro minerals. These can be, for the most part, they can be stored in the body, and so you don't require a constant intake. You do have kind of some flexibility about meeting their needs over time, which also makes it a little bit more difficult to establish firm requirements. So let's go to requirements real quick. I have a bunch of numbers on here. We will actually send you these slides as well as the recording. But there's a few things I just wanted to point out. And so the first thing, we're going to jump down here to the micro minerals. So starting here at cobalt and going down to zinc, one of the things I just really wanted you to see is that if you look across the different types of animals, so I have a lactating cow, I have a pregnant cow, I have a nursing calf, and I have a growing calf. If you look at the micros, you'll notice that we really don't have differential requirements for these types of animals. For cobalt, it's 0.15 parts per million across the board. For zinc, it's 30 parts per million across the board. And that's partially, I would say, because of the challenge of determining requirements. But also, I say it's because the challenge of determining requirements, but it's because they can use stores. The one exception would be manganese, and you can see manganese requirements is a little bit higher in pregnant and lactating cows than in the growing animal, and that is because there was a little bit of work that basically showed the importance of manganese for reproduction and suggested that they did have a bit higher requirement for reproduction. If we go up here to our macros, the thing I really wanted to point out to you is that if we look at calcium and phosphorus, the requirements for the cow are relatively low compared to the calf. So if we look at calcium and phosphorus for this growing calf at say 500 pounds, they're almost double the requirement for calcium than even a lactating cow. If we look at the phosphorus requirement, it's almost the same as a peak lactation or early lactation cow. So we do need to be looking at, in particular, our phosphorus. Calcium often is sufficient in forages. I will say there's a few exceptions, and one exception would be small cereal grains. When you look at small cereals, like if you're grazing wheat, triticale, or rye, they are usually quite low in calcium, and you can see some benefits, including growth performance, especially on growing calves, if you provide it. Okay, so this is in general what the animals require, but then the next question is, what do I need to supplement? So while there's a considerable variation in forages, as Jesse alluded to, we can use the averages to tell us something about what is commonly deficient. And we did get a question, so I'm going to take a moment here before we move to this section to answer the question about liver biopsies. Liver biopsies have been the gold standard for assessing mineral status. You are 100% correct. However, it's not a recent change, but liver biopsies only tell us a few minerals, to be frank. in terms of the variation in status. They will tell us if we're getting into what I would call clinical deficiency, just like blood does for some other minerals. So he pointed out copper and selenium and vitamin A as minerals where we see the storage really fluctuate. And so we can kind of tell where we're at and what we have been feeding and how that's impacting their status. But like if you look at manganese or even zinc, honestly, until we are in real trouble, we really don't see those numbers shift that much, even in the liver. And then for our macros, liver is not a storage location. So really for macros, we really don't have a great indicator of status unless, of course, we're getting into clinical deficiencies, and then blood will tell you because essentially you will see them basically be tanked. So the bottom line is no, things haven't really changed. Yes, liver can tell us some things, but it's an oversimplification to say that liver will be the best way to assess what I need to be supplementing because of its limitations, especially with so many of the minerals. We're much better off to look at what we're feeding and compare that relative to the requirements. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some forage concentrations and talk about how they match up to the requirements. So the first thing I'm going to show you is some classification of samples of grass from Nebraska. So over about a 7-year period, we were able to get data from ward labs. So samples that honestly, producers from Nebraska sent in. And we just looked at, okay, so grass samples that would be what we call premium or greater than 13% crude protein. So these would be like your vegetative pasture. If we look at the macro minerals, so calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sulfur, we see that in general, we have a very low percentage of those samples that would be considered deficient for a lactating cow. So I'm using a lactating cow here because her requirements, of course, for these macros are greater than a dry cow because the milk does have calcium, phosphorus, magnesium in them. And so we see here, they look pretty good. Magnesium sometimes is short, as we all know. We have that challenge of those cool season pastures. But a lot of times that challenge is actually due to over here, this potassium or K being actually too high. So we call it antagonistic. And what that really means is that the challenge with minerals is not just that the concentration of that element tells you everything you need to know, but sometimes you have to look at the concentrations of other elements because they interfere with the absorption. So in this case, we're talking about potassium and magnesium. So grass tetany is often caused actually not by really low magnesium in the forage, but actually high potassium and nitrogen interfering with magnesium absorption. So this 33% here is probably those cool season early pasture samples where we do have that really high. I mean, greater than 3% potassium is quite high. And so that is one of the things we do have to pay attention to. If we go up to, say, good, so less than 13%, but greater than 9. So you can kind of think of this as either really kind of late in the season, mature pasture, or even good hay. We do see then, compared to a lactating cow requirement, the phosphorus would be low in 62% of the samples. Calcium's still sufficient. Magnesium is low in 75% of the samples, and you see that sulfur is generally met in both of these samples. There's a few samples where sulfur would have been low. So what does that tell us? Well, if you don't match your lactation up to the maturity and the quality of the forage, then we can run into some troubles with phosphorus and even magnesium. If we look at across Nebraska, if I just break it down by location, based off of the zip code where those samples came from, I kind of just wanted to show you that it does seem like the sandhills is probably the one that's a little bit most at risk, especially when we get into some of those a little bit more mature samples. So if I had an early lactation cow, uh, she requires 0.23% phosphorus on a dry matter basis. And if she was on more mature pasture at that point in time, we'd be short about 0.03% phosphorus. So what does that look like? Well, 0.03% phosphorus, because it's very common to see either 6, 8, 12, and even 16% phosphorus in a 4-ounce mineral. What are those providing? So how much phosphorus would I need to make that 0.03%? Well, in a 4-ounce free choice mineral, between 1.3 and 2% phosphorus in the mineral provides 0.01% in the diet. Okay, so the reason we have this range here is just that 1.3 would be, if I did the math for that target, that 4 ounces. 2 is a number that we use because not all cattle eat the target. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this gives you kind of an idea of the range that you might want to target if you were trying to get that 0.03% phosphorus in the diet. So 1.3 to 2% phosphorus equals 0.01 in the diet. So in the mix, I would need between 4 to 6% phosphorus to be providing that 0.03. So that kind of gives you some idea of, all right, well, what would I really need? And if we go back and look, that early vegetative pasture is more than sufficient in this case across the board for that early lactation cow. It's really not until we get into these more mature pastures where even in early lactation we're short. And by the time we get into mid or late lactation, their requirements have decreased. So I would say phosphorus is one of those things that you really should take a look at, especially in your own samples, because phosphorus is an expensive component of the mineral. And you really don't want to be over supplementing it because it can be quite costly. And then the other thing to point out is that, especially like if you are one of those people who calve in February, right? And so you're having early lactation cows, let's say in March before your grass is ready, and you're using hay or other stored forages, don't forget about the supplements you may be providing and what they are bringing into the diet. So in this case, distiller's grains is very popular, of course, in Nebraska, and it can provide quite a bit of phosphorus to the diet. I mean, 1 pound is providing the equivalent of that 4 to 6% in that 4-ounce mineral, right? Because it's providing 0.03% to the diet. So 1 pound of distillers is providing quite a bit of phosphorus. And when we get up into 2 and 3, by 3 pounds, you're almost providing half of the requirement of the cow. So don't forget to account for that. Alfalfa is also a fairly good source of phosphorus, not quite as high, of course, as distillers grains, but sometimes understanding that you're bringing in your phosphorus from another form is good to recognize. So if we look at the micro minerals now of those same grass samples, I really just want to point out that zinc and copper here are commonly deficient. In fact, they are the most common deficiencies we see across the U.S. Manganese, on the other hand, is rarely deficient in grass pastures. And again, that is pretty consistent across the U.S. And then iron is also not deficient. In fact, most of the time, iron is double plus their requirement. And so we don't need to be supplementing iron. Somebody in the survey asked a specific question about iron, and they said, well, do we need to reevaluate the iron requirement? There isn't, admittedly, a lot of data on iron in beef cows in particular. However, the requirement's based off of young calves who have, admittedly, would have the highest requirement for iron. And so I feel fairly comfortable with 50 parts per million being probably conservative, I will say, maybe in excess of the requirement. And so I would say, no, I don't think we need to be reevaluating the iron requirement of beef cows. And I don't think there is a benefit to supplementing more. In fact, we'll talk about it, but I do think supplementing extra iron is going to cause you more trouble than benefit. Uh, because as we were talking about before, uh, we have these interactions, and iron is one that can have some interactions with other minerals. So zinc and copper, commonly deficient in Nebraska, commonly deficient across the US. So this is some older data, but this was almost 700 samples from different locations in the US. And I really just wanted to point out, if we look at copper here, 66% were marginal just based off of their concentration. Zinc was 44 marginal and 33 deficient. So again, a similar 70 something percent that was less ideal or adequate. So if we look at the other thing that we need to consider here, sorry, got muted. The other thing that we need to consider here is the possibility of antagonists. So we're talking about iron. Iron is a potential antagonist for copper. It's not as bad as molybdenum or sulfur, but we can see that there was about 19% of the samples across the US that had iron levels that would have been considered antagonistic. But when we look at molybdenum, this is where things get a little bit worse. So said copper was marginal, so meaning not quite as much as we need, but then we add molybdenum on there at 40% being marginal, another 8% being high, so almost 50% of the samples having some antagonistic level of molybdenum, and that's where we run into problems. It's what we call secondary deficiency. So copper is usually a challenge across the board. Some locations are, of course, worse than others. You know, if you go to, say, Idaho, for instance, they mine molybdenum there. So molybdenum is a big problem in Idaho. In Nebraska, though, surprisingly to me anyways, is that molybdenum is also a challenge here. And I would have thought the concentrations were going to be higher in the east and less in the rest of the state, and I was wrong. So what I have here is basically that same data set, but now it's kind of broken down by location. The eastern part of the state was a little bit lower in molybdenum than the rest of the state. But on average, we run about 2 parts per million of molybdenum. And that is actually tying up enough copper to where when we look at, say, even our fresh grass, so that vegetative grass in much of the state has almost 8 parts per million of copper. The requirement is 10. So we're like, oh, we're providing almost 80%. We only have to provide 20% and we'll be fine. Unfortunately, if we have 2.5% molybdenum in there, we're actually down to only providing less than 1 part per million because that molybdenum is tying up so much copper. So our general rule of thumb is that for every 1 part per million of molybdenum above 1 part per million, we actually need an extra 8 parts per million of copper. So we basically almost need to double the requirement if we have 2 parts per million of molybdenum. So the bottom line is copper is going to be fairly low in most of our pastures in the state. Hay is not quite as bad in terms of the tie-up that molybdenum has on copper, but it still is going to tie up a decent amount. You know, we're running somewhere around half of the requirement being available to a little bit less here in the lower quality forages. So bottom line is that zinc and copper are going to be deficient. Selenium is quite variable. I mean, even in the state of Nebraska, across the US, but even in the state of Nebraska, we can have areas that have potentially toxic, and we have areas that are definitely deficient. I would really highly encourage you to, of course, sample your own forages and get selenium analyzed. At a very minimum, talk to, your local extension agents to kind of get an idea of where you sit, because selenium is one of those. He's showing you the potential for deficiency versus the potential for um, toxicity, and selenium kind of has a narrow range there. Okay, so I wanted to show the math just a little bit on copper. If I have this 8 part per million rule and what that really looks like. So if I had this forage and it has 9 parts per million of copper in it, but it has 2 parts per million of molybdenum, then I need 1 part per million of copper to get to my 10. That's the requirement. Plus, I need the 8 parts per million of copper to account for that extra molybdenum. So I now need 9 total parts per million to get to the requirement of 10. That means that I need between basically 1,200 and 1,800 parts per million in my 4 ounce mineral to be meeting the needs of the animal. So that's kind of what that would look like in a forage source with 2 parts per million of molybdenum. Okay, Jesse.
Okay, so now to get to corn silage. When it comes to corn silage, we're really focused on the two big M's when it comes to minerals when it comes to mineral evaluation, and that's magnesium and manganese. So in magnesium, we see that our corn silage is already relatively low in magnesium, and we can actually exacerbate the issue with magnesium due to the amount of potassium that could be present in that corn silage. So Mary already alluded to that potassium and nitrogen is our major tie-ups of magnesium when it comes to that antagonistic effect. And so that could also be even worsened when it comes to if we were to add alfalfa as well to that diet. So alfalfa comes in with high levels of potassium as well. And we're going to see greater tie-ups of that magnesium to the point where we could see some tetany issues when it comes to corn silage or corn silage with alfalfa.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
probably one of the most common questions I get from veterinarians is they have a problem. They have cows dying, and it's almost in the winter it happens a lot where it's like they have their cows start lactating in January or February. They bumped up the amount of alfalfa they're feeding with corn silage, and they get grass tetany essentially. They get magnesium deficiency. So it's something to be aware of if you're feeding a diet like that. Um, Starting your high mag mineral then makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then manganese, when it comes to that one, our real issue there is iron, the presence of iron being in the silage. So corn silage is already relatively low in manganese. And so whenever we have iron present, now when it comes to iron being high in our forage samples that we collect, we're not too worried about that because that source of iron is typically dirt contamination generally. And if that happens, that iron is in its unavailable form. So it's not really available for absorption for the animal. However, when soil contamination happens in silage, that acidic environment that is present during the ensiling process creates an environment for that iron to become more available, essentially. And so now we have iron and manganese who both share the same transporter in the body that allows for the absorption of manganese. So now we have two minerals competing for that transporter. So essentially, let's think of a bus. Bus only has so many seats. So that's our transporter. Iron is taking up all those seats and it's not allowing the manganese to be absorbed. Another issue that iron causes for us is that it can actually, when the body senses the presence of high available iron in the digestive system, it will actually downregulate that the amount of seats that are available, or that transporter. So now we've just removed seats that manganese and iron are competing against. And so we've really reduced the ability for manganese to be absorbed. So whenever you're looking at your silage samples that you get analyzed, you're looking to see if your iron content is greater than 500 parts per million. Now, area times where that could become a major concern, of course, we could have that iron contamination from the field, but it can also be increased if we are putting our silage on the ground. We're using a type of bunker where it has soil surface contact. That's some areas where we could become really concerned with the amount of iron that could become present in our silage. Oh, I guess I should talk about some deficiency signs when it comes to manganese. So the two images of the calf. So Mary talked about how the levels of manganese for our cows, the requirement is 40 parts per million for that gestating cow. Another reason besides the reproduction is also the development of that fetus. Manganese is very important for cartilage formation. And so you can see here in the images that we found, there's plenty other older images online. It is we will actually see the pasterns kind of curve over or buckle over, and that is that malformation of that cartilage. We also see weak calves. We can see the lower jaw actually extend out past the upper jaw. So you'll see those bottom teeth. And then we can also see snub noses. And again, that is just from that cartilage formation. And so that's why making sure we have plenty of manganese present for cows that we're trying to breed up or gestating cows is very important. We can also see weak calves as well. So just be aware of that with manganese.
Yeah, sometimes people have weak calves and it can be manganese deficiency, especially happens more frequently with feeding the corn silage in gestating cow diets. I do want to make a point though that any silage can do it, and in fact silages of course that you lay down and wilt like small cereals, or even like sorghum sudan for instance, if you're making silage out of those, you do want to be careful about how you're raking or how you're picking it up, because if you do put a lot of soil in there, this is, of course, a risk.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Okay, so we've given you a lot of math, we've thrown a lot at you, but what does this mean? When it comes down to it, this is exactly what you're working with. You're working with a mineral tag. And so how do we take what we just talked about, or how do you take what we just talked about and apply it to that mineral tag to assess if this mineral is going to work for you? So we're going to assume that all these cows are eating the target. So that's why we're going that target 4 ounces. So that's why we're going to use the 1.3% in the mix equals the 0.01% in the diet for our macros. So if we look at phosphorus on here, this mineral is providing 6% phosphorus. At that rate, if we divide that by the 1.3, we can see that it's providing 4.6 and or 0.04% in the diet. So I want to jump back to what Mary was showing on one of the screens previously. We won't switch slides, but she was talking about our more mature forages, 11% crude protein in the sandhills, providing 0.20% phosphorus. And so if you look at it and look at this mineral, we can see that we're adding an additional 0.04%. So if our lactating cow requirement, if we had lactating cows on a mature forage, or we had our phosphorus coming in at that lower level of 0.2, we can see that this mineral would actually help us achieve and meet our phosphorus requirement for that animal. So now we'll jump over to our micros, our trace minerals. So 130 parts per million in the mix equals 1 part per million in the diet. So we'll take that 775 for zinc is the one we're going to use for our example. We divide that by 130 and we can see that it's adding 6 parts per million in the diet. So if we have a forage that's coming in at 25 parts per million in the diet, then we can see that this mineral is going to help us reach that minimum requirement for our zinc. Now, as I like to say, the minimum requirement, because now we're going to talk about the level of insurance that you might want to have on your animals. But before I jump to that, Mary, is there anything else you want to add on this slide before I jump on?
Well, I will say I'll muddy the waters with minimum requirement and zinc. I would say uh, somebody asked about um several minerals and should we be feeding more of them? And I would say if I was going to pick one that perhaps I think the requirement is low on that feeding more you may see a benefit, it would be zinc. So the 30 parts per million is the requirement across the board fairly consistently with growing and finishing animals, we see a response to additional zinc supplementation above 30 parts per million. And I would say when I think about nursing calves, I think that there is definitely going to be a benefit to supplying more. The bottom line is if I was going to pick one where I might actually bump it up, it's going to be zinc. Okay, so he was talking about insurance. There's another type of insurance we want to think about.
Yeah. So the other type of insurance we talk about is making sure we are hitting the target. And how many cows are we hitting the target for? So this is actually some pretty new data that we have from a research project here at UNL, where we were looking at the amount of mineral consumption for some cows that were out on corn stalks. They had unlimited access. As you can see here, you can see that some of these cows were consuming almost a pound a day of mineral if they wanted to. And that is, if you look at our figure here, you can see that, it's pretty evenly distributed across herds. We are going to have those over consumers and we're going to have those under consumers. But typically, we're going to have half our cows right in the middle where they are hitting that target. And so if we have half our cows making a target, that means that 50% of our cows are not even consuming enough mineral to get to our target. So what can we do? What do we want to do? And so we've really been pushing some numbers of what if we try to achieve to get 75% of our cows to reach that target. We're going to see essentially could it pay for itself now instead of having 50% of our cows in that optimal range, right? To where they're going to help pay for that mineral. Now we have 75% of our cows in that optimal range, if you refer back to that figure that we showed you at the beginning. So that changes the math a little bit. If we go on to the next slide, if we're trying to target that, so the numbers that Mary had told you previously, the 1.3 to 2%, this is where the 2% comes in. For our micro minerals, if we change the math, that 2% in the mix is now 0.01% in the diet instead of 1.3 in the mix is 0.01% of the diet. That's how we're achieving getting 75% of our cows to reach that target intake. Essentially, what we are doing is we are increasing the concentration of the mineral that of each nutrient that needs to be present in that mineral mix. For our trace minerals, we need to see we would change the number from 113 to 200 parts per million in the mix equals 1 part per million in the diet. So now I'm still going to jump back to the same exact example I used for you previously. If we have forage in the sandhills that's at that 2.0 and we have a 6% in the mix, we're still at that 0.03% in the diet. Now we are right at the requirement for our lactating cow. For zinc, if I use the same example I gave you of 25 parts per million, we're not going to make it. We need a little bit more zinc than considering the 775. If you take into account what Mary just told you, that if there was one mineral that we were going to increase or double, it would be zinc. We're definitely far under that line. So those are just areas that we would want you to pay attention to, when it comes to your intakes. We have a project going on right now, and we see that we have cows that are at the mineral feeder every single day when the feeder automatically allows them to have access. And we got some cows that we don't even see once a week. And so it just varies. The herd varies. You're going to have those over consumers. You're going to have those under consumers. And so doing the best you can to try to capture as many animals as you possibly can in your herd to reach that target.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to do now, we're kind of reaching close to time. So next time, We'll talk about vitamins. So we'll talk about vitamin A, and we'll also go ahead and talk about a mineral calculator we've developed. So we went through a lot of math today, and we talked about the antagonists and the potential of them to interfere with absorption and needing to adjust for that. And then we also have this, how much do you target in terms of insurance to account for the variation in intake? And we've kind of incorporated all of that into a calculator that you can use to evaluate your situation. So we'll work through some scenarios with the calculator, and we'll show you a little bit about how to use it so that, of course, you can evaluate your own situation. And then we focus on getting the concentrations right in the mineral. But we also need to make sure that the intake is right. We don't want the intake to be too low, of course, and not get the concentration we're looking for. But we also want to avoid overconsumption. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage that free choice mineral intake to make sure your program is cost effective. With that, we'll start addressing questions. We do have one unaddressed, well, we have two unaddressed ones in the chat. So the one from Ed here, he was actually asking about the requirement variation from one animal to another. He said, is there requirement variation? And I'm sure there is differences in requirements of animals. I mean, you see that from a macro nutrient level, for instance, energy and protein. One cow does just fine on something, and another cow doesn't do so well. And then he asked, well, could you cull for mineral requirement? And I would actually argue that you might already be doing so and you just don't know it. And the reason I would say that is naturally, if you think about, I am culling cows who don't perform, and cows who don't perform within your system, which means that if you aren't providing minerals, then cows that have a higher requirement probably aren't going to do as well. So I will say that we do know there's some differences like breed variation. I will tell you that we have not dove in enough for us to have differential requirements, even based off of breed. For instance, we know the copper requirement of Simmentals and Angus are very different. And it is because they have some differences in the transporter in terms of excretion of copper. And so, Simmental versus Angus, the efficiency of copper use, I guess I'll say, is different. Another question that we got is, do you think if a calf is exposed to mineral at a young age, it'll be more likely to consume more regular later in life? That's an interesting question. We do have a little bit of data just looking at calf intake, nursing calf intake, and cow intake. And I will tell you that we really did not see a correlation between cows who ate more and their calves who ate more. The calves who were high eaters weren't necessarily from the cows who were high eaters, which was kind of interesting to me. But I will say that we do know, at least within cows that are high eaters tend to be high eaters and cows that aren't tend to not be. And I think it's all about the drive for salt. It's about palatability. And so I think some cows like salt more than others. Just like my brother and my brother loves salt, and I think he'd salt potato chips. And I, on the other hand, forget to salt anything. So unfortunately, their intake and even their drive is not really based off of their requirement for certain minerals. It's all about palatability salt, which we'll talk a lot more about in the next session.
I think one thing, Mary, also to that one too, and what he's saying is being exposed at a young age and then more likely to, continue consuming or get more used to it is, yeah, the sooner you can get them exposed to that mineral, the more likelihood they are going to continue to consume that mineral a little bit later. You think about the calves we have on project now, at first they would come in and take a little bit of mineral. But then the longer they were exposed to it, right, they were showing up every day wanting to consume that. And I think it comes back to exactly what you're saying, that palatability. They like the taste of it. They found something good, right? And so they're going to revisit every day at the feeder, as long as it tastes good to them. That's their
Yeah,
drive.
and I do think that when you think about exposure, novel things, they tend not to eat very well and they've been exposed. So like if you're thinking about weaning time and those high stress events, them knowing what it is and knowing how to eat it is also a benefit.
Yep.
Rob asked, is there a relationship between minerals and calf scours? And yes, if you're in that subclinical or even clinical deficiency area, there are a lot of the minerals, especially some of the trace minerals, that are really important for immunity in several ways. So some of them are about the ability to respond to pathogens. So just talking about recognizing and killing pathogens, like they have benefits for our neutrophils and our macrophages, the things that basically attack pathogens once they get into the body. And then we also think about things like copper being important for recognition. And so we think about like response to vaccinations and those types of things. So yes, I would also say that we're going to talk about vitamin A next time. And I would say vitamin A is clearly linked to calf scours, especially early in life. That low vitamin A can cause uh, increased incidences of diarrhea in calves. And so I do think that if I was to think about calves, and I know we use the example of growth response in calves with zinc. That's just because it's a one you can actually measure, if that makes sense. But immunity and health is probably the major reason why I would think about making sure I am providing uh, trace minerals in particular to my herd. So it's their ability to mount immune response and have a lower, even just maybe not even lower incidence of sickness, although I would say that's true too, but even just how quickly they recover because their immune system is primed to be able to function properly. And the first question of the day, which we should get to, was organic minerals. So organic minerals is always a common question that we get. And if we think about mineral sources. I just put on the slides here some relative bioavailability numbers. What does that mean? Well, if you think about, we were talking about some minerals interfering with other minerals. Well, relative bioavailability just means how much of that mineral will get absorbed. And in general, organic minerals are more bioavailable than inorganic minerals. The how much depends. Like if we look at like copper sources, for instance, depending on the study, we see something from 100 to 130%. If there's a lot of the molybdenum and sulfur in a diet, like copper chloride, basic copper chloride, which is kind of a quasi-organic in that it's not actually chelated to an organic mineral, but it has the same covalent bond, so the same type of bonding. It could be up to 200% available. But then in diets that didn't have those, it wasn't any more available. So the answer is it kind of depends. But this is always one of the questions. Do I need organic? And I would say that there's been studies and pretty much across the board, I would say the common thing that I see about organic minerals is that they can help you get your status up a little bit more quickly. And that means that if you are deficient, you will see a response because you're bringing them out of deficiency. However, if you have a good mineral program and they're not deficient, you're probably going to see no additional advantage because you're in that range of where it's level, right? And you're not seeing additional benefits. And so, question is always like, are they worth it? And I would say if you're in a situation where you are not providing uh, enough mineral, say to your cows, like they go out on a range or something, and you're trying to get their status up quickly, or maybe you bought some cattle in and you don't know, anything like that, there may be a benefit to using an organic during that period of time. But usually, what you'll see is that over time, you see no additional benefit because if you keep providing the inorganic, they're going to get to status. And so, if I have really high antagonists, like I've lived in some places where they had very high molybdenum and sulfur. You may need to be providing the organic just to be able to keep up with the antagonists. But for the most part, I would say a solid mineral program can be solely based off of inorganics. Perry
I
asked,
think, well,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
think, to your point, and just, you threw a lot at them right there, but I think the main walking away message from it is there isn't a magic when it comes to organic minerals. They are not magical. They do have a function, they have a place, right? But depending on where you're at, and if you are implementing a year-round, well-balanced inorganic mineral program, that might be sufficient for you.
Yep, I would say that's true. Um, Perry asked if a cow is properly supplemented, will her calf be properly supplemented with mineral in milk? Jesse.
Yeah, so milk can actually be a poor source of micro or trace minerals. We do see the reason we have a greater requirement for some of those micro minerals is because they are present in the milk. Now, vitamin A, which we'll get to next time, that is the primary source of vitamin A for the calf, right? Nursing through colostrum. Is that correct, Mary? And
Yeah,
so.
colostrum.
Yeah, has to be through the colostrum. And so you cannot rely on the milk that calf is receiving during nursing for its mineral. Now, the calf will typically build up its stores while it's still in gestation, right? And so that's why it's very important that we are meeting that copper requirement and zinc requirement of that cow while she's gestating, because she is giving that calf what it's going to have when what it's born with. Now, I think, Mary, correct me if the numbers, if I'm off on it, about 2 to 3 months of age is when we're going to start seeing those stores really wear out on that calf. If the mineral is out there being provided, that's also the same time when we're starting to see that calf consuming that mineral, getting up close to the target of 4 ounces, about what 65% of 4 ounces is what we can see them consume, and so that's why having that mineral out there available to them as well. We see some producers that are building mineral feeders that might be high elevated off the ground, or have those big rubber mats that are real thick that calves can't lift with their head. So we need to make sure that we're providing a mineral feeder that the calves also have access to, so that they can consume that mineral supplementation in order to get their levels back up that they would have lost from what they received from the cow during gestation.
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. So the cow can supply macro minerals in the milk, does supply trace minerals through gestation, but those levels wear out, of course. And vitamin A is provided through the colostrum, and that's actually milk is a poor source, really, of vitamin A as well. So overall, we do need to be thinking about supplying that calf after 2 months of age, and so making sure we have access for those baby calves is important.
I think the one thing I left out was also what else is happening to that calf as it's getting around that, what, 2 to 3 month age, and that those antibodies that calf received from the colostrum are starting to go away as well, right? And
Yep.
so making sure that we are providing them the minerals, the key minerals that are very important to immune function and stimulating an immune response, zinc and copper, and making sure those calves are getting that.
Yep, exactly.